Hello, folks. Welcome to another SACPA session, and welcome to our Wednesday session in acknowledgement of November 11th. SACPA acknowledges that this event takes place on the lands of the Blackfoot people and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and we pay respect to their past, present, and future cultural heritage beliefs and relationships to the land. I'd like to welcome today with us Lauren Finch. Lauren has been a biologist for 50 years, working on many issues related to the use of land and water. Lauren is a professional biologist, a retired professional fish and wildlife biologist, was one of the co-founders of the stewardship initiative Cows and Fish, and a former adjunct professor with the University of Calgary. Lethbridge is home, where he pens articles and essays on issues related to Alberta's landscape and critters. Lauren, it's so good to have you with us today. Here, we're so used to seeing each other in person on SACPA sessions, but here we are over Skype, and it's working wonderful. And I personally am looking very much forward to your talk. And I'm sure so are our viewers.
Thank you, Annalise, and good afternoon, folks. When the Minister of Energy convened a coal policy committee to provide a vision or a new vision on coal for the eastern slopes, 5 of us retired fish and wildlife biologists provided a submission to the committee based on our 50 years of experience, or a period of 50 years experience dealing with coal in all of its facets. And so I'm going to summarize some of that submission for you today. By the way, if you want to read the full submission, please go to the Coal Policy Committee website. Next. The issue, I think, sometimes is that people haven't had an opportunity to see what coal development looks like. And so here is what it looks like. Next. It has many facets. You could call it a brutal intervention on the landscape, and it is, and it has many steps. But to have a look at something close to home. Next. This is a series of photos for Tent Mountain in the Crow's Nest Pass, showing that essentially, what happens is heavy equipment and explosives remove overburden. That overburden is dumped as close as possible to the excavation. The coal is removed, the site is smoothed a bit, the revegetation is attempted, and the site is abandoned. Next. The issue that we often face, though, is that coal, like all other land uses, are cumulative at a watershed scale. And there's no question that, in fact, the one in the middle is Grassy Mountain, the legacy mine site. And 20 cumulative effects assessments over the last 23 years in the eastern slopes have given us a pretty good sense that we either are approaching or we have exceeded thresholds for ecological integrity. Next. And the cost of ignoring cumulative effects is that many of our wild species, like threatened species like bull trout, go missing. Next. And this is really about the reality of the shrinking pie. We all think that we come into the world and we have a full pie's worth of resources at our disposal. The reality is we come in with many slices missing, and we no longer have all those resources and opportunities left. So we need to think about that shrinking pie when we think about, the prospect of coal mining, for example. Next. And when we focus on the immediate, we miss the additive impact of the past. And so all those past land use activities also influence our decision, or should influence our decisions on what we do today. Next. For example, road density. This is a key ecological threshold. The recommended threshold is 0.6 kilometers per kilometer squared. Most of the eastern slopes now ranges between 1 and 6 kilometers per kilometer squared. So we have wildly exceeded those ecological thresholds. Next. This graph, red is a graph showing grizzly bear populations, the black is bull trout populations in relation to road density. And so, this is a probability of occurrence. And so the more roads we build, the more likely that these critters are to wink out of existence. Next, a cumulative effects assessment done by the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society indicated that at the present time, we're running at a red line in the Old Man and Bull watersheds, and that's going to mean the substantial risk to threatened trout species, which are indicators, by the way. Next. In fact, all native fish species, that's trout or stream-dwelling trout species in the eastern slopes, are either of special concern, uncertain status, or are threatened or endangered. So this tells us a lot about our land use practices and what the effects of those have been. Next. So let's talk about coal mine development. There are some processes and issues. Next. Coal exploration is the first step. There's no impact assessment done per se. And so what this tends to be is perfunctory assessments of issues. The decisions are rushed. Next. There's no oversight. Next. And there is really no firm plans in place for reclamation of the footprint, and there is no performance bond. So the coal companies that do these things are not held to a performance bond, which would guarantee that some level of restoration would happen. Next. Then there's site preparation, and essentially that's removing all of the vegetation and the overburden to get at the coal. Next. And mine development has a scale to it, and oftentimes it appears that this is relatively small scale, but the impacts can occur over hundreds of kilometers, particularly downstream. Next. One of the big issues with mine development is the interception and contamination of water. Next. And this results in a whole bunch of wrecks. And we looked at every open pit coal mine in the eastern slopes, and we've had experience with all of them. There were operational and structural failures on all of them, and these resulted from a variety of factors, not the least of which is this is very complex, challenging terrain in which to build mines. And the other thing is that there's a failure of oversight and regulatory enforcement, particularly on the part of the province. Next. Coal mines really have a dramatic impact on erosion and sediment, up to 1,000 times that of undisturbed forest slopes. And this shot of Grassy Mountain will give you an indication of why that might be so. Next. The point is that sediment above background levels has a dramatic impact on the physical habitat, particularly fish, of their life cycle requirements and of survival. Next. And this is exacerbated by extreme weather events that are rarely modeled and incorporated into mine designs. And so, as the cartoon series on the right-hand side of the screen indicates, you cut down all the trees, you remove the ability of that vegetation to intercept and slow flow, and it's predictable what will happen, which is greater hydrologic response, flooding, and more erosion. Next. And as a result of that failure to model these, there are operational and structural failures. This is a settling pond that was built below a spoil pile on the Tent Mountain mine that, frankly wasn't maintained, and it blew out the berm. And now the downstream portion of East Crow's Nest Creek is still covered with all of the erosion remnants of the mining impact. Next. And these tend to be massive acute sediment releases that coat the stream bottom and render a lot of the ecological processes and values as nil, and impact, of course, fish populations. Next. The Mount Polley independent expert review panel investigating that dramatic failure of a berm said something I think that we need to keep in mind when we're assured that we can design these things in a way that nothing will happen. They said it is axiomatic that nothing in engineering or in life can be assured with 100% certainty. And I think we've seen that in our experience as biologists with all of the coal mines in the eastern slopes, is despite the engineering or the attempts at engineering, there were multiple repetitive failures in every mine. Next. The thing that I tend to look at is fish, because that's my background. And I think it's useful to point out to people that fish aren't just a product of the water, they're a product of the landscape. And if you tinker with the landscape, you're going to impact fish. And that's going to tell you something about whether or not our management systems, our engineering, and so forth are actually effective at maintaining ecological health and resilience. Next. The point about fish and their presence, their abundance and distribution, they're telling us something, because fish are integrators, they're indicators, and they're sentinels. So when they start missing, when their populations go down, when their distribution starts becoming disjunct, then I think it's a signal and perhaps a report card on our failure to manage watersheds successfully. Next. What we're doing is we're transforming watersheds that have habitat for trout that is cold, clean, complex, and connected into systems that are warmer, dirtier, simpler, and fragmented. And that doesn't help fish populations. So in summary, what do coal mines do to fish? Well, they impact physical habitats, water quality decreases, and contaminant levels increase. There are hydrologic shifts, so you get greater floods, higher degrees of floods, and often lower flows later in the year. And the sediment additions become chronic and acute for fish populations. And those affect fish physiologically as well. Next. Two issues, I'll just pick a couple in terms of contaminants. One is calcite, which literally cements stream substrates together, so that literally if a fish wants to spawn, it would need a pick and a shovel to break through that cemented level to be able to create a redd or a nest into which eggs are put. The other one, which is prominent in this discussion these days, is selenium. And selenium certainly has an impact. It's been documented by many researchers. Next. And I think the big issue here is that there is no demonstrated successful selenium treatment available that's capable of reducing concentrations to safe levels, that's proven at mine scales and over long periods of time. And in fact, recent sampling in the Crow's Nest Pass for legacy mines like Tent Mountain show that selenium levels, even after closure of that mine in 1983, are 20 times what the provincial standard should be for selenium. Next. Our our submission to the Coal Policy Committee, based on our review of it, is the aquatic environment is harmed by coal mining, and trout and coal mines cannot exist. Next. Now, from a wildlife perspective, what happens? Well, again, similar to fish, there's a direct loss of habitat. There are physiological stress issues and avoidance, fragmentation of habitats, and so forth. And all of these are cumulative in terms of their impact on wildlife populations. Next. For example, grizzly bears. They're currently designated as threatened in Alberta, and they're impacted by a variety of things, including the road network that mines need, recreational pressures that happen around mines, and industrial land uses like mining have been implicated in declines in grizzly bear populations. And most importantly, this is not something that they can evolve with, because their life cycles are less than the length of a mine. And so there's no learning that happens so that they're ready if and when a mine is done and restored. Now, the thing that I think we all need to be cognizant of is that we are assured that mitigation will solve all of these issues. Next. And I do point the one on the left, which is in my neighbor's backyard. He had a branch that rubbed on his window, and he went out and started cutting away at his cottonwood tree. And before he knew it, this is what was left. And the way he mitigated this tragedy was that birdhouse on the top of that stump. And so I'd like you to think of mitigation in that context. I think as well, next, there's a way that we can use our children's nursery rhymes to help us understand about mitigation and restoration. If you blast the top off a mountain and dump the materials into the valleys, you can start to imagine, even if you're not a technical expert, that all the king's horses and all the king's men will not put that mountain back together again. Next. Now, there are assumptions made primarily by the proponents of coal mining about things like fisheries mitigation, that if you build habitat, that it actually equates to critical habitat. And the point being is that we may not understand fully what critical habitat is. And if we don't know what to build to restore it. We assume that those built habitats will increase populations, but research has shown it just shifts the fish population around. It doesn't actually increase it. We often don't look at stream productivity as a limiting factor, and yet, without a certain building block of things like insects, stream populations of trout won't increase. And and more importantly, there's an assumption that if we build habitat, it will persist. And I'll get into some descriptions of research that I've done that show this isn't real. And so fish populations may move around, but they may not increase. And so this blows the mitigation theory out of the water, quite literally. Next. I think the thing that we need to recognize in the systems where coal mining happens, these are high gradient streams, they're dynamic, channel shifts occur on a regular basis, bed load movement, the movement of substrate gravels and boulders downstream is common. So it's hard to put a structure in place. And if you start at the upper left-hand corner, this is some work I did years ago, we thought that if we built some log revetments in the upper right-hand corner, that would assure that the fish population would be benefited. But all it took was one flood, and the lower left-hand picture is a picture of that revetment high and dry. And so this speaks to the failure of mitigation if we don't understand the dynamic nature of stream systems. Next. In a similar way, this is another bit of work that was done. You can see the arrows showing that pipeline crossing, or an indication of it. The stream has shifted away, and all of that expensive habitat development work is now high and dry. Next. And the failure sometimes, and you can see that they've engineered these cross-sectional low head dams in a mitigative sense in this new channel, but it fails to recognize that there is some physics at work here, and that doesn't actually work to maintain those systems or those habitat improvement things over time. Next. Now, this is often the picture on the left is often what is referred to as a stream mitigated after coal development. But the stream on the right is, of course, what a native natural stream looks like. And I'm sure all of you can make the differential between the two. Next. Now, this speaks to the, whether or not we can actually build things that last and that are of value to fish in streams. And going right to the bottom to southern eastern slope streams, this was work done on over a decade of building mitigative and habitat improvement structures in streams. This was an assessment in pre-1995 where, yes, about 63% of the structures were maintained, but after the 1995 flood, only 19% were left, and that didn't actually speak to whether or not they effectively provided fish habitat. So the challenge of restoring a stream after coal mining is greater than I think the proponents of coal mining development would have you believe. Next. Now, this is from a wildlife perspective. This is a kind of a montage of pre-disturbance biodiversity. Next. This is what you get after coal mining development. You may get some bighorn sheep that will occupy these places, but this is deceptive. And next, bighorn sheep depend on native winter range as critical source habitat. And if that isn't present around a mine site, those bighorn sheep populations will not persist. Next. And this is based on some fundamental biology that the grass species that they use for critical overwinter survival have the ability to retain protein content after freezing. Coal mine restoration generally uses agronomic species, soft grass species as they're called, which the protein content plummets after freezing, and so they don't provide the same benefits, even though it turns the landscape green and the impression is that we've successfully reclaimed. Next. So just the presence or absence monitoring doesn't provide a full picture for wildlife response to restoration. And if we don't have adjacent native source habitats, we aren't going to see much benefit on mined reclaimed sites. Next. I think the other thing is that a lot of the issues that we've seen with the latest resurgence of coal have jumped over land use planning. And the regional plans and sub-regional plans should actually guide this as something else should. Next, which is science. And if we don't use evidence-based forms of information to guide our resource management decisions, we know what we get, and that's a trashed landscape, which doesn't have value from an ecological perspective. We may see hydrologic impacts in terms of downstream flooding, and I don't think the economics of it pan out. And so next, I think this speaks to, a message to the Minister of Energy and this government is that first we need land use plans, and then we need policy on sectors. And so hopefully the Coal Policy Committee is going to provide a good rendition of what our coal policy should be, which would be no mining in the eastern slopes, and then the minister would accept that. Next. it follows, I think, some old principles. I call them the rules of the earth. And I think if we followed these principles through, whether it's coal mining or other land use activities in the eastern slopes and elsewhere, we would be far further ahead in terms of making good resource management decisions that are in the public interest. And I think the last one is the most important. We humans are in the loop. And so mines that produce contaminants that cannot be remediated will affect us in one way, shape, or form. Next. I think this is the fundamental problem that we suffer from in resource management decisions, is that development is always in capital letters and conservation is always in small letters, and it's an imperfect balance. And we need to somehow find a balance that allows economic development where it can be accommodated, but not at the expense of our natural systems, which are already providing us a variety of ecological goods and services. Next. Lastly, this was our message to the Coal Policy Committee regarding the Pandora's box of coal development in the eastern slopes. Our recommendation was, don't open it. If it's open, close it, and never open it again. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much for this presentation. Was great. Sorry, I just realized I had your last slide on, but you didn't talk about your last slide. Yeah, sorry, I posted it up anyway. Sorry about that. Okay.
That's fine. Yeah.
Knut Peterson, the comment often used by pro-coal mining enthusiasts is that if BC can do it a few kilometers away, why not Alberta? Can you please explain what a disaster coal mining is in BC?
Well, Knut, I think it is a good question, and I think the observations that people have is that, well, surely if BC is doing it, Alberta can do it, and maybe do it better. The problem is that BC is not doing it better, and if I just picked selenium concentrations as an example, they have spent millions of dollars in a variety of attempts to deal with selenium contamination, and have yet to provide a workable system, if indeed a workable system is ever available, with the technology that we have. And so I'm not sure that having BC next to us is an incentive for us to follow. I think it would be an example for us to shy away from.
And so how can we convince our government of that? Sorry, begs the question, right?
Yeah. That's another good question and a perennial one, particularly with a government that seems adverse to evidence-based materials. I'm not suggesting that science is always the only thing that should guide us, but it should be part of what guides us. And this government doesn't seem to be able to understand that we have a wealth of evidence available. For example, in the cumulative effects assessments that have been done in the eastern slopes, that should provide a strong message that adding another land use, particularly one like coal mining, it is not a beneficial thing from an ecological perspective. And I won't talk about the human health issues, the social issues, the economic issues, or the cultural issues. But we need to use science to help us make decisions. And if you have a government or an administration that is adverse to science, you know what we get.
Yeah, unfortunately we do. Our next question is from Leona Jacobs. Have you had a chance to look at the pivot by Motum re Tent Mountain to move to hydrogen versus the coal project under review? What are the eco impacts of this idea?
I've only had a quick view of it, Leona, and I mean I think I got to give them credit for strategy of pivoting somewhat, to ensure that the investors and potential investors in that mine are still on the hook. I don't know if this is a viable project or not, just based on the water volumes that they say they have, and what energy can be created with that, and whether or not enough hydrogen can be made, to warrant the investment. What I worry about is that Montum has still not said that they won't mine coal. And remember, Montum has leases north of the Crow's Nest Pass in the Racehorse and Vickery watersheds, and their original intent was to open Tent Mountain, get a bit of cash flow so that they could start mining north of the Crow's Nest Pass. And I think it's a realistic fear that this could be part of their strategy with this pivoting from a coal mine to some greener technology. I would be somewhat pessimistic about their ability to do it from an engineering perspective, from an economic perspective, and whether investors would buy into this.
Our next question comes from Juanita Fisher. I know it's not a coal mining, but now they are talking about hydrogen plants. Do you know what impacts they will have in our water, on our water rather?
Yeah, and again, this is the Montum pivot on the Tent Mountain. As I understand it, the proposal is to use two old mine pits that are filled with water. One is at a higher elevation than the other. They would extract water, drop it down in elevation, create electricity that then would be used to develop hydrogen, and also to pump water back up to the pit above so they could repeat the process. I guess if it's a closed system, the impacts would be somewhat minimal. But if it requires water added from our natural streams and rivers, then that gets back to, do we have surplus water to do that? And the quick answer is we don't.
Okay, our next question comes from Sarah Bradley. Are you optimistic that the committee advising on a coal policy will provide good advice? And if so, will it be taken?
A quick scan of the Coal Policy Committee's website in terms of the submissions made to it, would indicate that those submissions and the people that have submitted most of them, it's in line with where Albertans are at, and Albertans are firmly in the arena of we don't want coal mines in the Eastern Slopes. So I think the Coal Policy Committee would have a very hard time going against that weight of evidence and information that they have gotten to date, that indicates that this is not a starter for Alberta, and that a new coal policy for Alberta should include no coal mining in the Eastern Slopes. I think the question about whether or not the Alberta government will accept this, might revolve around some of the legal issues. There are freehold coal holdings that are waiting in the wings to be developed. And if the Alberta government comes out with a no coal policy, these companies that hold these freehold rights may then have an avenue to sue the government for compensation. And so I think the reason, and we just heard today that the Coal Policy Committee has got an extension for their report to December 31st. And I suspect that's what's leading a lot of the discussion is how do we stick handle around a message that that might be no coal mines in the eastern slopes, but avoid the specter of compensation that might happen by saying that directly.
Okay. I'm just going to go back to one of your slides, the slide on the grasses, native hard grass, most difficult to restore versus non-native soft grass. Could you elaborate a little bit more about why they aren't restoring it to the native soft grass? Like, why are
The
they,
native hard,
yeah,
the native
yeah,
hard grass.
sorry, yeah,
Yeah, the the issue is, well, first of all, those agronomic species, the non-native species, are much easier to establish on coal spoil. Um, Native hard grasses are exceptionally hard, and I would say virtually impossible to restore on on profiles of mine spoils that really have no soil left on them. And things like rough fescue grass species, have been very problematic. It's very difficult once they're destroyed to get them reestablished again. Now, there have been attempts made to get native vegetation established on these coal spoils, but the reality is it doesn't take. Um, it's subject to a lot of failure, and what we're left with, or what mine companies do, is they want to get it green as fast as possible for the visual impression and the recognition from the government that they have done something, and so that's what we're stuck with. So if it's difficult to get native grasses established on mine spoil, it would be even more difficult on mine spoil where there's already agronomic species established.
and so just to follow up, a follow-up question, if you don't mind, Lauren. Um, does this non-native, like the grass that they restore it with, does that become invasive? Like, does it start taking over even further?
It has the potential to do that. Yes, yeah. I must say though that you know even these agronomic species struggle to make a living on mine spoil. I mean, this is material that has virtually no soil profile because you can't salvage enough soil from mountainsides to lay over this mine spoil afterwards. They're often at extreme angles, which means that erosion is a constant problem. Wind continues to move that material around. And so, these are not garden spots by any stretch of the imagination.
Right. Our next question comes from Laurie Schultz. Can you comment on the government's proposed water policy / permit changes and its impacts?
I'm not sure specifically what you're talking about, whether it's allocating water to coal mine companies. Um, the government, of course, vehemently denies that they have done this. The reality is that coal mines need water, primarily for washing coal. I mean, how else could they term it clean coal if they didn't wash it? And that requires a substantial amount of water, more water than is frankly available in some of the small streams on watersheds where coal mines are proposed. And of course, this runs head into recovery plans for threatened native trout species, which obviously require water to survive, as well as the needs for downstream water users like the irrigation industry and us water drinkers in Lethbridge.
Knut Peterson, are you aware of any coal mining explorative activity still happening now, even though Alberta has paused development?
No, Knut, I'm not. And again, I think one of the other positive signals in today's announcement from the Minister of Energy is that she's extending that moratorium on coal exploration until such time as the new coal policy comes out, whenever that might be. But technically, they should not be exploring for coal right now because the minister has put a moratorium on it.
Till the next election. Oops, did I say that? Laurie Schultz, out of scope for your presentation today, but can you comment on recent reports of lithium mining for electric vehicle batteries and its impacts? Australian Mining Co. appear to be interested in mining this.
Yeah, I'm not up on it, but I am aware of the new bits of policy or legislation that the Alberta government has enacted. And the one comment I would make, and this also follows the announcement of this Trails Act, is that a lot of these policy decisions leap over completely regional planning. And it should be regional planning and sub-regional planning that help define whether or not these things should occur, when they can occur, and where they can occur. And by doing otherwise, we've essentially set up the opportunity for regional plans to fail. As an example, the Trails Act, and as the minister said in his press announcement, would give the opportunity to build more trails. Well, the issue is that we already have exceeded the ecological thresholds in virtually all of the eastern slopes for roads and trails. If we want to do things like restore native fish populations or caribou or protect elk or grizzly bears, we actually have to reduce the number of trails and roads and do a substantial amount of reclamation and restoration. And so, this Trails Act and probably the Minerals Act leaps over the opportunity to have a robust conversation done through regional and sub-regional planning, where Albertans can be engaged in this and provide some input, particularly on an area that is deemed so critical and important by Albertans, such as the Eastern Slopes.
Ian Hurdle, the first reasonable test for low-level selenium only came about in 1985. It seemed there is a large time lag from when we can actually measure and then recognize it. Sorry, the language here is a bit weird. Recognize TH period comment problem. Sorry, Ian.
Yeah, as an example, I think I know what you're getting at, Ian. I mean, this selenium wasn't something that was given much prominence until quite recently, and the impacts of selenium probably didn't have the research background to them that we now understand now. And so, as an example, Alberta has I'm not sure it's a line in the sand, but it's a suggested concentration of 2 micrograms per liter or parts per billion. Now, as an example, Montana, that has watersheds that have been impacted by mining in BC, have enacted a threshold of 0.6 micrograms per liter, so much lower than the BC government has, for example. And so, I think this is this constant tug of war between what's right in terms of what's good for the ecosystem and what industry thinks they can provide or wants to get away with.
Our next question comes from Knut Peterson. Our local Lethbridge East MLA is indicating that research around reducing selenium in contaminated water is promising. Are you aware of what he's talking about?
Well, I'm not sure what promising means in this regard, since Tech on the other side of the border has had several promising leads in terms of selenium contamination reduction that still don't meet the standards, the extended standards in BC, let alone the standards that the state of Montana would require for waters passing over their border.
Okay. Our next question comes from Beth Mundell. Hi, Lauren. Is there any way to help fish spawn on the calcified stream beds, perhaps by adding sand or gravel?
Well, work has been done on this, but you know the sad part of it is that once calcite has been introduced to the system and continues to trickle in, it is virtually impossible to mitigate the effects of that. As an example, I read years ago where salmon populations in some of the California rivers we're at a low ebb because of gold mining in their headwaters, releasing tremendous amounts of sediment, including calcite. And one of the mitigative techniques was to drive caterpillars with essentially big harrows behind them up and down stream beds to break up this cemented substrate. But it was never successful because there was still more to come. And so the best mitigative option, the best management option is to keep it out of the water in the first place, just as the best management option for selenium, despite the promising aspect of contamination reduction, is don't let it get into the water in the first place.
Our next two questions are from Bridge City News. You mentioned there are no longer places in the eastern slopes where coal development can be safely accommodated in an environmentally and effective way. Can you explain?
Well, this is based on the review that the five of us made of every coal mine development in the eastern slopes that we had some level of experience with, either in the exploration phase, the mining or development phase, and in the restoration phase. And so our contention is that coal mining, that involves mountaintop removal, and that's what virtually, all of these coal mine proposals would be, is that they would resemble what has been done in the past. The past is an example of what will happen in the future. And so based on that, our contention is that there is no place that a mine development could successfully be done and still retain all of those aspects of hydrologic response, ecosystem function, biodiversity, or water quality.
And the second question by Bridge City News, and I know I'm skipping the queue, but I'll come back to those folks in a minute. An extension to the Coal Policy Committee has been given until December 31st. Does this give you pause and more hope for a better outcome before the final submissions are sent to Minister Savage?
I don't know if it gives me any more confidence. I suspect that they're dealing with a variety of issues, one of which I mentioned before, which is for those freehold coal owners and how to stick handle around, saying no to mining in the eastern slopes without being subject to compensation. The other thing is that I suspect that the Coal Policy Committee has been overwhelmed by submissions. And as I say, based on what I read in their website, submissions and comments from Albertans that are against coal mining. And so I think they're trying to do, a credible job of weaving all of that material into a document, or maybe two documents, as I understand it, that provides the minister with the most ironclad answer possible for her to make the right decision related to this.
Leona Jacobs, and I'm just putting up the slide. I'm hoping this is the slide she's referring to. I think it is. Leona Jacobs, your cartoon illustrating flooding reminds me of a comment made re the Old Man Dam. Has there been any examination of increase in sediment in the Old Man Dam from development upstream?
I'm not aware of any, Leona, but I think the 2013 flood probably provided pause for many engineers and water managers who thought that the capacity of reservoirs, wouldn't be impacted by these floods and bedload movement. As an example, the TransAlta reservoirs in the Kananaskis system, now have a much reduced volume because of the erosion and movement of bedload into them with the 2013 flood. One can speculate, and I think there are lines of evidence that would suggest that as our land use footprint increases in the watersheds upstream of these reservoirs, that erosion and sediment transport is going to increase as well. I don't think that's an untoward assumption, and that would continue to reduce the storage volume in those reservoirs and change the operating potential of them substantially.
Our next question comes from Bev Mundell. Would it be fair to say that our fish/trout are our canary of our environment?
I think it would be more than fair to say that, Bevan, and as a former fisheries biologist, I'd make the point that fish, particularly native trout, are a report card on our ability to manage a watershed successfully. And if every one of the native trout species is in decline, is in some sort of species at risk category, it tells us something about our ability to successfully manage watersheds.
Our next question comes from Knut Peterson. I'm surprised farmers and food processors downstream the Old Man River hasn't voiced more opposition to coal mining, i.e. a contaminated watershed. Arguably, it could threaten their livelihood.
Yeah, Knut, I'm a bit surprised by that myself. I think there's a couple things at play here. I think the first thing is that for many irrigators, and I'm just speculating here, for many irrigators, the source of their water is so far away from them that it's like city dwellers thinking that water comes from a tap rather than comes from our headwaters. And so, the recognition of what happens in the headwaters and the impacts of land uses there could flow down to them may be missing. So it's a maybe an education or an engagement problem. I think the second thing is that, and again, I'm speculating here, is that it's often hard, for an industry like the irrigation industry that has such financial support from the Alberta government to seem to want to bite the hand that feeds it. And perhaps that's why there has been not much concern raised on the part of those people.
Laurie Schultz, again, out of scope, but support for the Eastern Slope mining are based on jobs and the economy of nearby communities. Would you have any suggestions or ideas for job creation for redirecting such support?
Well, economics isn't my field of endeavor, and so I'm not sure that I can provide much more than just a somewhat uneducated guess. But I think that what we need to do in any land use proposal is do full cost accounting and measure the short and long-term benefits versus the costs and see if that is actually in the best interests of Albertans, including those who would be employed, for example, in the mining industry. Um, do we want to create a boom and bust economy and suck people into it? And that's essentially what coal mining has been in the Eastern Slopes, is a boom and bust industry. Um, is it fair to lead people on with expectations and then have them dashed, because of technical difficulties or frankly the coal market collapses? Um, should we be looking at more sustainable forms of economic endeavor? Absolutely. What those are, I think, should be left to people much brighter than me.
A little bit out of scope here again, but I'm posting up your science versus everything else cartoon where everybody's going the simple but wrong way. And it seems that this, or at least for me, it seems that you can apply this to an awful lot of things, including the vaccine or the way that we're handling COVID, or how do you, how do we go about creating an education system maybe that would recognize complexities in science, where we maybe educate people early in life about the complexities? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Annalise, this is a perplexing subject to someone who has a science background. And I see that people, run away from science and in fact embrace the ignorant rather than the ones that have the knowledge that could help them on a path. I don't know what the answer is, and I suspect it's getting worse with with social media and people only adhering to what their tribe says. Um, would it be beneficial to start earlier? Yes. I think what we need to do at all levels, from children to adult, is introduce the idea of critical thinking, the ability to use information, the ability to sort through information to understand what's the correct stuff or the evidence-based stuff versus what's the dross. And instead of just listening to your tribe, um, do a bit more comprehensive dive into the information beyond which supports your current belief, and move to something that might challenge your belief, and move then to a much greater understanding of the evidence out there for a different perspective.
Ian Hurdle, my concern about downstream selenium is the potential contamination of three provinces' agri-businesses and turning their products into undesirable ones, similar to GMO label for EU. Can you comment, please?
Well, the only thing that I could add to this is that the selenium that contaminates the Elk River in BC, has found its way down, I think, 300 kilometers into Montana. And so, is there a limit to the distribution of selenium from its source? Probably not. And I think that's what's at the crux of the conversation here is that there may be no limit to how far down selenium impacts water quality, agricultural products, and so forth in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. So, even though we may not know or may not understand now, we need to do the critical monitoring of water quality so that there is an indication of what the benchmarks are today, and ensure that we guard against that. Now, I think that one of the things that we can use as a surrogate is that all the mines in the coal branch in the McLeod River, in tributaries to the Athabasca and North Saskatchewan, could be used because they're still pumping selenium out of those legacy mines and the existing mines, and that could be the way to understand how far downstream selenium and a lot of these other contaminants move, as a guide to whether or not we want to introduce that in the South Saskatchewan River Basin as well.
That's it for our questions. We have some thank yous from Beth Mundell, Jim Miller, Laurie Schultz, and also on behalf of SACPA, Lauren, thank you very much for your time and this very informative, wonderful presentation, sobering as well. Before we wrap up today's session, do you have a take-home message for our viewers today?
Well, I would reiterate something that one of the media questions related, and that was, as one of our summaries in our submission to the Coal Policy Committee is, and I'll just read it to you, the eastern slopes of the Alberta Rockies are not a frontier of unrealized possibilities. Instead, they are a busy landscape where expectations already exceed the ability of the landscape to absorb these dreams. There are no longer places in the eastern slopes, including current Category 4 lands, where coal development can be safely, effectively, and environmentally accommodated. I think that would be my best take-home message related to the experience of myself and my 4 colleagues who have spent a long time reviewing and immersed in coal mining in the eastern slopes.
Thank you so much, Lauren. More thank yous coming in the chat. Folks, join us again next week. We're back on Thursday next week at our regular time of noon with Dr. David J. Finch. An exodus of young people. Is this Alberta's future? And I look forward to seeing you all then.
Thank you.